Less than a minute after lifting off from UC Davis Medical Center, a Reach Air medical helicopter went down on Highway 50 in Sacramento. No fire, one crew member lost, two others fighting to recover. The NTSB hasn't ruled anything yet, but early data and new video already raise tough questions about what really happened in those final seconds. Let's start with what we know. Not guesses, not speculation. The helicopter was an Airbus H130, also known as the EC130 T2, registration November 414, Roma X-ray, operated by Reach Air Medical Services. This is a high-end, single-engine turbine helicopter, smooth, powerful, and commonly used for air ambulance work because of its quiet operation and great cabin visibility. On this flight, Reach 5 had just completed a patient transfer at UC Davis Medical Center and was heading home to Redding, California. The plan was to make a quick refueling stop at McClellan Airfield, just a few miles north of Sacramento, before continuing the flight north. On board were pilot Chad Millward, flight nurse Susan Susie Smith, and flight paramedic Margaret D.D. Davis. A tight-knit crew, all of them experienced in emergency medical aviation. Tragically, Susie Smith later succumbed to her injuries after the crash. According to NTSB data from Flight Radar 24, the helicopter lifted off from the hospital pad and climbed normally, about 450 to 500 feet above ground level, accelerating through 40 knots of airspeed. So far, everything looked completely normal. But then barely 1,000 feet from liftoff, right over U Street, the climb suddenly stopped and a rapid descent began. The descent rate increased quickly, 600, then 800 feet per minute, and then the data stopped. Moments later, the helicopter slammed into the eastbound lanes of Highway 50, tail first, before sliding across the pavement. Witnesses saw it impact hard, but what's remarkable, truly remarkable, is that there was no post-crash fire. That's thanks to the crash-resistant fuel tanks installed on newer H130. They're designed to prevent fuel spillage even in a violent impact, and that very likely saved lives here. Nearby motorists, including people stuck in traffic from an unrelated accident just up the road, ran toward the wreckage. Some even helped lift the helicopter off one trapped crew member until firefighters arrived. It's an image that's both heartbreaking and inspiring. The kind of humanity that shows up when things go really, really wrong. Now here's where the investigation starts to get really interesting. Two videos surfaced, both from different angles, and together they tell us a lot about the helicopter's condition in its final seconds. The first video, filmed from the westbound lanes, shows the helicopter descending nose high, meaning the nose was slightly up relative to its descent path. That's a strong visual clue for a possible autorotation. You can actually see the helicopter maintaining a controlled attitude. It wasn't tumbling, it wasn't spinning out. But then, just before impact, it appears to strike something. Maybe a wire, maybe a pole, something that jolts the aircraft before it hits the ground. The second video, captured from a completely different angle, confirms what we're seeing. A low-energy descent and a tail-first impact with the embankment before the helicopter slides onto the freeway. No explosion, no visible fire. Just a hard, fast, but somewhat controlled, forced landing attempt. What's extremely telling here is how smooth that descent looks. If this had been a total loss of control, a tail rotor failure, a mast bump, or a dynamic rollover, it would have looked chaotic. But this one doesn't. It looks like a power loss situation where the pilot was doing everything he could to manage an emergency auto-rotation, trading altitude for rotor speed, trying to reach a survivable landing area. At this point, early data and video strongly suggest a forced landing attempt, likely triggered by either an engine failure or a sudden mechanical issue that took away available power. Investigators will eventually confirm whether the helicopter hit a wire, lost rotor energy, or simply ran out of altitude before the flare. But based on what we can already see, this pilot was fighting to get that helicopter down safely, right in the middle of a dense urban corridor. Let's dig into what was likely the heart of this whole event, auto-rotation. When a helicopter loses power, the only thing keeping it in the air is the wind rushing up through the rotor blades. The pilot immediately lowers the collective, letting the airflow keep the blades spinning purely by momentum. That stored rotor energy is what cushions the landing, and managing it under pressure is one of the hardest things in helicopter flying. But here's the scary truth. This maneuver depends completely on altitude and speed, and Reach 5 had almost none. The Airbus EC130's height-velocity diagram, basically a map of which combinations of height and airspeed are survivable, shows a deep red area right after liftoff. It's called the dead man's curve, and when you launch from a hospital rooftop, you're literally taking off inside that red zone. You're low, slow, and surrounded by buildings. At around 400 to 500 feet AGL, the pilot would have had maybe 5 to 8 seconds to recognize the problem, lower the collective, stabilize the rotor RPM, and pick a landing spot. That's barely enough time to even say the words engine failure. In those seconds, the pilot's only hope was to convert whatever altitude he had left into rotor speed and aim for a clear area. Unfortunately, in downtown Sacramento, that meant one thing: the freeway. The videos and radar data suggest exactly that. A deliberate glide toward the highway, nose slightly high, energy being managed for a controlled descent. But the trade-off is brutal. Every second you spend trying to reach an open spot, your rotor RPM decays a little more. You arrive with less cushion to absorb impact. It's entirely possible the pilot stretched the glide to clear the final row of power lines, then either clipped one or lost just enough rotor energy that the tail struck first. That's not pilot error, that's physics. When you lose power in a single-engine helicopter at 400 feet, you are fighting against the margins of what's aerodynamically possible. Now, the environment around UC Davis and Highway 50 made this situation even more unforgiving. The area is dense: power lines, poles, trees, rooftops, traffic. There are almost no open fields or clearings. The freeway, ironically, is the best forced landing option within reach, but even that comes with its own hazards. Multiple videos show thin utility wires crossing near the impact zone, and you can actually see one small wire momentarily snap as the helicopter descends. Add in the fact that this was around sunset, and you've got one of the toughest visual environments possible. Low light, long shadows, and glare from the west. It's the perfect recipe for depth perception errors, especially when everything is happening in seconds. But here's what's truly incredible. There was no fire. That's not luck. The EC130 is equipped with a crash-resistant fuel system designed to keep the tanks intact, even in violent impacts. Combine that with energy-absorbing seats, stroking landing gear, and a rigid occupant cell, and you start to see how modern design can literally decide whether people live or die. Those features did their job. Despite a high-speed impact, the fuel system held, and the cabin remained mostly intact, and because there had been another accident on the freeway earlier, emergency crews were already nearby. Within minutes, they reached the site, pulled survivors out, and stabilized them. It's a brutal scenario, but it also shows how engineering and human response together can turn what should have been a total loss into a partially survivable accident. Zooming out, this accident highlights one of the most controversial trade-offs in the air medical world: cost versus capability. Most U.S. air ambulance operators, including Reach, rely heavily on single-engine helicopters. They're efficient, affordable, and certified for night and IFR operations. But in exchange, they carry a built-in vulnerability: no redundancy. One engine failure means one shot at an auto-rotation. Twin-engine models, like the EC135 or AW109, can climb out from a rooftop even if one engine fails. But they're more expensive to buy, maintain, and fuel. For rural or smaller programs, that cost difference is huge, and that's the uncomfortable truth. The economics of emergency medicine sometimes push operators to work right up against the edge of the risk envelope. It's important to note, the crew wasn't inexperienced or unprepared. Reach pilots and medics are highly trained, and auto-rotation practice is a key part of recurrent training. But the reality is, Real-world emergencies almost never look like simulator drills. At 400 feet over a city, there's no room to glide, no flat field to aim for, just wires, trees, and traffic. When the NTSB finishes its investigation, they'll focus on the key technical factors: the engine teardown, to see if there was a mechanical failure, the fuel and control systems, to rule out fuel starvation or linkage issues, rotor and transmission continuity, to verify mechanical integrity, wire strike mapping, to confirm what the helicopter may have contacted, and how the descent profile compared to the EC130's height-velocity diagram. Until then, we can't draw hard conclusions. But this crash reminds us just how razor-thin the margins are in emergency helicopter operations. Every second of altitude, every knot of airspeed can literally decide survival. And that's the real lesson here. You can be the best trained crew in the world, flying one of the safest aircraft in its class, and still face a situation where physics just wins. If you want updates, as the NTSB releases new findings on Reach 5 and other air medical safety cases, make sure you're subscribed. We'll keep breaking down what these early clues really tell us, and what they mean for everyone flying out there.